The auditorium was full, and every seat was taken, and still more students were standing in the back near the walls, trying to find space. Professor Kythaan walked slowly to the center of the stage, and his 4 compound eyes scanned the room, taking in more than 300 young alien faces from dozens of different species. He was old even by Veltari standards, and in his long career, he had studied over 900 species across the galaxy. But today, his hands were trembling, and that had never happened before. He said, and his voice carried across the silent room, "We begin the most dangerous module of this entire course." A few students laughed nervously. He let the silence stretch. "Today, we study humans." The laughter stopped immediately, and something cold and heavy settled over the room like a blanket made of dread. In the third row, a young Delvani girl named Rilka leaned forward in her seat, and her translucent blue skin flickered with pale light the way it always did when she was nervous, because her species was empathic, and she could feel the emotions of every living thing around her, and right now she could feel fear rolling off Professor Kythaan like heat from a fire. It scared her more than anything, because she had never once felt fear from him. Next to her sat Torvin, a massive Krethkai, built like a walking fortress with silicon armor plating covering every inch of his body, and he crossed his enormous arms and snorted, because he was not afraid of anything, and certainly not afraid of some soft-skinned species from a backwater death world. Ben them floated Xian, a Nalik student who existed as a shimmering cloud of sentient gas, with no solid body and no nervous system, and therefore no concept of physical pain at all. And Xian found the whole topic mildly academic. Kythaan pressed a button, and a holographic image of a human appeared in the center of the stage, and it was life-sized, and it rotated slowly, and 300 students stared at it. "No armor," said Torvin with visible disgust. "No venom sacs," whispered a Draenei student from the back. "No natural weapons at all," murmured someone else. Kythaan nodded slowly and said, "You are correct. And by all standard measurements, humans appear to be one of the weakest species to ever achieve spaceflight, and they have no claws, and no fangs, and no venom, and no armor, and no camouflage, and their skin is so thin that a simple blade can open." I paused, and yet I tell you now that humans are classified as the single most dangerous species the Galactic Compact has ever encountered. The room exploded with noise, and students were talking over each other, and several were laughing in disbelief, and Torvin actually stood up from his seat and said, "That is ridiculous, Professor, with all respect. That thing looks like it would die if I sneezed on it." Kythaan did not raise his voice, and he did not argue, and he simply pressed another button. A new image appeared. It was a scan of a human nervous system, and it glowed like a web of fire spreading through every inch of the body, and it was dense and intricate and breathtakingly complex, and it pulsed with light in a way that made several students physically uncomfortable. "This," Kythaan said, "is the Human Pain Network, and it is one of the most advanced and sensitive pain receptor systems in the entire known galaxy, and humans feel pain with a precision and an intensity that most of you in this room cannot even imagine." Rilka felt her own empathic glands activate just looking at it, and a dull ache spread through her body, and she gripped the edges of her seat. Kythaan continued and said, "A human can feel the difference between a cut and a burn and a bruise and a fracture, and they feel it all with extraordinary clarity, and their brains process pain faster than almost any species we have ever studied at Draenei." Student in the back raised a shaking appendage and said, "Professor, my species can die from pain shock, and we have therefore evolved the strongest pain avoidance instincts in the galaxy. So surely a species with such extreme pain sensitivity must have evolved even stronger avoidance behaviors than us." Kythaan looked at the student for a long time. "No," he said. The room went quiet. Rilka felt something cold crawl up her spine. "No," Kythaan said again, "and humans did not evolve to avoid pain, and they did not developed stronger avoidance instincts, and they did not build their civilization around the principle of minimizing suffering. He turned off the hologram and the stage went dark, except for his 4 glowing eyes. They did the opposite, he said, and his voice was barely above a whisper. Now humans seek out pain. They choose it, they run toward it, they pay money for it, they compete to see who can endure more of it, they celebrate it, they turn it into art and sport and ritual, and they teach their children to do the same. 300 students sat in frozen silence. Arilka realized she had stopped breathing. Torvin had slowly sat back down and his armored hands were gripping the desk so hard it was cracking. Even Zine the gaseous Nalik had gone completely still, and their cloud form had compressed into a tight, dense ball, which was the Nalik equivalent of absolute terror. Kythaan walked to the edge of the stage and looked out at them all and said, I have studied 914 species in my career, and I have never encountered anything like this, and I want you to prepare yourselves because what I am going to show you over the next few lectures will challenge everything you believe about biology and survival and the nature of strength itself. He turned to leave and then stopped. One more thing, he said, without turning around, and I have sent the first batch of human cultural data to your study pads, and I suggest you do not open them alone. The students filed out in silence. Arilka walked back to her quarters on legs that felt like water, and she sat on her bed and she told herself she was not going to open the files tonight. She opened them. The first file was labeled Marathon Running, and it contained a simple description of an event where humans run 42 kilometers on foot without stopping until their muscles tear and their bones ache and their toenails fall off and their bodies scream at them to stop, and they do not stop, and they do this for fun. Rilka read 3 sentences and her empathic glands fired so hard that she collapsed off her bed and hit the floor and lay there gasping as phantom pain ripped through her body. She lay on the cold floor shaking and staring at the ceiling, and she whispered to the empty room, what are they? Word had spread across the entire university in less than a day by the time Professor Kythaan arrived for his second lecture on humans. The auditorium had been expanded twice, and still there were students crammed into the hallways pressing their faces and sensory organs against the windows trying to see inside. He stood at the center of the stage and looked out at over 600 faces, and he could see it in all of them, and it did not matter what species they were because the expression was the same everywhere. They were terrified, and they could not look away. Good morning, he said, and today I'm going to show you what humans do to themselves on purpose. And I need you to understand that everything I am about to present is not punishment. And it is not torture, and it is not warfare, and it is what humans do during their free time for enjoyment. He let that sink in. He pressed a button, and a video began to play. And it showed a human running, just running. The students watched and waited for something to happen, and then Kythaan explained that this human had been running for 19 hours straight through a desert, where the temperature was over 50 degrees, and the human had already vomited twice, and their feet were bleeding. And one of their toenails had fallen off completely, and they were still running. Torvin leaned forward in his seat, and his silicon armor plate shifted uneasily, and he said, Professor, how far is this human running? 160 kilometers, said Kythaan. Through a desert, said Torvunyas. Said Kythaan. Volundary, said Torvunti. Paid an entry fee, said Kythaan. Torvin sat back and said nothing, and his massive hands were shaking, and this had never happened to him before in his entire life, because his species could not feel pain, and he had always considered pain to be a flaw in biological design. But now something was shifting inside him, and it felt like the ground under his understanding of the universe was cracking. Kythaan moved on. He showed them boxing, and he explained that 2 humans would stand inside a small enclosed space and strike each other with their fists as hard as they could, aiming for the head and the body, until one of them could no longer stand and the other. Humans would sit around this space and watch and cheer, and they would pay large amounts of money for the privilege of watching this happen. A day Valmori student who resembled a floating jellyfish began to weep from 7 of its 9 eyes. Kythaan did not stop. He showed them tattoos. He explained that humans would sit in a chair for hours, sometimes for entire days, while another human drove a needle into their skin, thousands of times per minute, injecting colored ink beneath the surface, and it hurt the entire time, and the skin would swell and bleed and burn afterward. And humans did this to create art on their bodies, and some of them covered nearly their entire body in this art. Rilke was gripping her seat so hard her translucent fingers had gone white, and she could feel the phantom needle sensations rippling through her empathic nervous system, and she wanted to leave, but she could not move. Then Kythaan showed them something worse. Piercings, he said, and humans push metal through their own flesh, and they do it through their ears and their noses and their lips and their tongues and their navels and many other places I will not describe, because 3 of the species in this room could experience cardiac failure from the failure. From the stress, a Drangai student fainted and had to be carried out by medical drones. Kythaan continued. He showed them scarification, where humans cut patterns into their own skin and let the wounds heal into raised permanent designs, and he showed them branding, where humans press heated metal against their skin to burn permanent marks into themselves. The gaseous Nalik lost cohesion entirely, and their cloud form scattered across the ceiling, and 2 professors had to be called to help them recoalesce. And they drifted back to their seat, looking thin and shaken now, said Kythaan, and his voice was calm and steady like a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. I'm going to show you how humans eat. He displayed an image of a small wrinkled red fruit, and it looked harmless. This, he said, is called a Carolina Reaper, and is a plant that humans have specifically bred over many generations to maximize a chemical called capsaicin, and capsaicin does only one thing, and that one thing is to activate pain receptors in the mouth and throat and stomach, and it has 0 nutritional value and 0 caloric benefit, and it exists only to cause suffering. He paused and said humans eat these on purpose. Then he played the video. It showed a group of humans sitting at a table, and each one placed a Carolina Reaper in their mouth and bit down, and for a few seconds nothing happened, and then it began. Their faces turned red and then purple, and tears began pouring from their eyes, and their noses began running, and they started coughing and choking and gasping, and one of them fell off their chair, and another one was bent over with their hands on their knees, making sounds that sounded like dying, and they were laughing. They were crying and choking, and clearly in tremendous pain, and they were laughing. Grika stood up from her seat, and her entire body was shaking, and her translucent skin had turned dark purple, which was the Dalvani color of complete system overload, and the medical staff rushed to her and escorted her out of the auditorium before her empathic system collapsed entirely. The auditorium was in chaos now, and students were talking and crying, and several had left, and those who remained looked like survivors of some kind of Kythaan waiting for silence. He got it. One final thing for today, he said, and I want you to understand something called an ice bath, and this is when humans fill a container with water and ice until the temperature is near freezing, and then they take off their clothing and sit in it. Why? Whispered someone from the back of the room. Because they want to, said Kythaan. A student near the front raised a trembling limb and said, Professor, is it possible that these humans are criminals being forced to do these things as punishment? No, said Kythaan, and they wake up early on their rest days to do these things before their normal daily activities begin. The room was silent for a very long time. Then a Draenei student in the back stood up, and this one had not fainted but looked close to it, and their voice was shaking so badly that their translator could barely function, and they said, Professor, why, and please tell us, why do they do this to them? Kythaan turned off all the displays, and the room went dark. That, he said, is the most important question anyone has ever asked in this auditorium, and the answer is, what makes humans the most extraordinary and the most terrifying species in the entire galaxy. He walked toward the exit. "I have invited someone to answer that question for you," he said, "and she will be here next week." "Who?" she asked. "Torvanch is a human," said Kythaan, "and she has scars she chose to keep and ink under her skin she paid to put there, and she drinks a mild neurotoxin every single morning because she enjoys how it makes her feel." He stopped at the door. "Prepare yourselves," he said, and then he was gone, and 600 students sat in the dark, and not one of them moved. She walked in like she owned the room. 600 alien students had been sitting in terrified silence for 20 minutes waiting for the human to arrive. And when the door finally opened, every eye and sensor and optical cluster in the auditorium locked onto her like weapons tracking a target. Lena Vasquez was not what they expected. She was not large, and she was not armored, and she did not glow or hover or emit radiation, and she was just a woman of average human height with brown skin and dark hair pulled back from her face, and she walked with the easy, relaxed stride of someone who was not even slightly afraid of being in a room with 600 aliens who outweighed her and outsized her, and in many cases could have killed her without effort. She was carrying a cup of something dark and steaming. "That is the neurotoxin," whispered Torvin to Rilke, who had returned to class despite the medical staff's objections, because she needed to understand and she needed to see this. With her own eyes, Lena set the cup down on the podium and looked out at the crowd and smiled. And the smile was warm and open and completely relaxed, and Rilke felt it hit her empathic senses like sunlight breaking through clouds, because this woman was radiating an emotion that Rilke could not identify at first. It was not fear, and it was not aggression, and it was not dominance. It was comfort. This human was comfortable in her own skin in a way that Rilke had never felt from any being in her entire life. "Hey," everyone said Lena, and her voice was casual and friendly, and she leaned against the podium like she was talking to friends at a gathering and not standing before a room full of beings who considered her species to be walking nightmares. "I heard you all have some questions about humans," she said, "and I am here to answer every single one of them. So do not hold back, and do not be polite, and ask me the things that are keeping you up at night." Silence. Then Rilke raised her hand, and her translucent arm trembled as she lifted it, and she said, "Your arm, and there is art on your arm, and you put it there with needles." Lena smiled and rolled up her left sleeve, and the auditorium gasped. Her entire arm from wrist to shoulder was covered in a design of flowers and vines and leaves so detailed and beautiful that it looked like a living garden had been painted onto her skin, and the colors were rich and deep, and the detail was extraordinary. "This took 40 hours," said Lena, and she held her arm up so everyone could see. "And yes, it hurt the entire time, and the needle goes in and out of the skin thousands of times per minute, and the skin swells and bleeds and burns." She traced a flower near her wrist with one finger. "This is a marigold," she said, "and my mother grew marigolds in her garden when I was a child, and she died when I was 19, and I got this tattoo 2 years later, and every hour I sat in that chair with the needle in my skin, I thought about her, and I remembered her hands in the dirt, and the way she smelled like earth and flowers, and the pain made those memories sharper and clearer and more real than anything I had ever experienced." She looked up at the room. "The pain made it mean something," she said, "and if it did not hurt, it would just be a picture. But because it hurt, it is a promise, and it is a memorial, and it is love made permanent in my skin." Rilke felt tears forming in her large dark eyes, and she did not know why, because the emotion coming off this human was not sadness, and it was something bigger and deeper, and it ached in a way that felt almost sacred. Torvin stood up, and his massive armored body cast a shadow over 3 rows of seats, and he pointed at Lena's face and said, "The scar. And you have a scar on your jaw, and your medical technology can remove scars, so why do you keep it?" Lena touched the scar, and it ran from below her left ear to the edge of her chin, and it was white and slightly raised against her brown skin. "I fell," she said, and I was climbing a rock face about 60 meters high, and I was not using safety equipment because I chose not to. And I slipped and I fell, and a piece of rock caught my jaw and opened it up, and I could feel my own bone through the wound several. Students made sounds of distress. I could have died, she said, and I almost did, and it took me 11 months to recover. And the first thing I did when I healed was go back to that same rock face and climb it again, and this time I made it to the top. She looked directly at Torvuni. Keep the scar, because it tells me 2 things, she said, and the first thing is that I tried something that scared me, and the second thing is that I survived. And every morning, when I see it in the mirror, I remember that. I am someone who gets back up. Turvin sat down slowly, and he said nothing, but something behind his armored eyes was changing. Jean, the gaseous Nalik floated forward, and their cloud form flickered with patterns of light that meant deep confusion. And they said the burning food and the chemical with no nutrition that only causes pain. And please explain this, because my species has no body and no pain. And I cannot understand why any being would put fire inside themselves on purpose. Lena laughed. And the laugh was big and real, and it filled the room, and several students flinched because they had never heard a human laugh before, and it was loud and explosive and strange. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small bottle of red liquid. This is hot sauce, she said, and I put this on almost everything I eat. She opened the bottle, and a few students in the front row recoiled from the smell. Listen, she said, and this is maybe the most important thing I can tell you about humans, and the pain is not the point, and the pain is the door. And on the other side of that door is something incredible. She explained that when humans experience pain, their brains release chemicals called endorphins that create a feeling of intense pleasure and euphoria and calm, and this system evolved because their ancestors needed to keep functioning while injured during hunts and during survival situations, and over millions of years, humans learned to trigger this system on purpose. Pain is the price of admission, she said, and when I eat something that burns and my mouth is on fire and my eyes are watering, and I keep going and I do not stop and I push through it, then my brain floods with chemicals that make me feel like I can do anything, and it is the most alive I ever feel. She put the bottle down. Every species in this galaxy has a pleasure system, she said, but only humans have one that requires suffering as the key, and that is not a flaw, and that is our greatest evolutionary gift, because it means we are the only species in existence that gets stronger from pain. The room was dead silent. Lena leaned forward, and her voice dropped, and it became serious and heavy, and really was a field medic, she said, and I served in conflict zones on 3 different planets, and I ran toward explosions, and I performed surgery while the ground shook beneath me, and I carried people twice my size on my back through smoke and fire, and every part of my body was screaming at me to stop. She held up her scarred hands. I did not stop, she said, and no human ever stops. And that is what pain taught us, and it taught us that the body has limits, but the will does not, and when everything hurts and everything is broken and every nerve is begging you to lie down and give up, you can choose to take one more step and then one more after that, and that choice is what makes us human. Rilke was crying openly now, and she did not care who saw after the lecture. When the room was emptying, Torvin approached Lena, and he towered over her like a mountain, standing next to a candle, and he spoke quietly, which was something he had never done in his life. My species cannot feel pain, he said, and we have always believed that makes us superior, and that pain is a weakness and a flaw in biological design. He paused, and his armored face shifted in a way that might have been emotion. You have made me reconsider, he said, and pain is not your weakness. He looked down at this small, soft, scarred, smiling human. It is your engine, he said. Lena reached up and shook his massive claw with her small hand, and the scar on her jaw caught the light. Now you are getting it, she said. The explosion came without warning. One moment, the orbital station above Velther Prime was humming along in its normal peaceful rhythm with thousands of students and civilians going about their lives, and the next moment the entire lower habitation ring shuddered like a living thing that had been struck in the spine. The cargo module in Section 9 ruptured and the decompression cascade hit like a wave, and bulkheads screamed as metal twisted and atmosphere began bleeding out into the void of space, and emergency lights snapped on, painting everything in red, and alarms started howling, and in less than 60 seconds, the lower ring became a nightmare. Gravity plating failed in 3 sections, throwing people into walls and ceilings and floors that were no longer where they should be, and temperatures plummeted in some corridors and spiked to dangerous levels in others, where ruptured power conduits bled heat into the air, and structural supports buckled and groaned, and in 6 separate locations, emergency doors jammed halfway shut, trapping people in damaged zones that were losing air. Standard Galactic Emergency Protocol activated, and the station AI broadcast a calm, clear message to all inhabitants, and the message said, "Remain where you are and shelter in safe zones and wait for professional rescue teams, and do not attempt to enter damaged sections under any circumstances." And every species on the station obeyed. The Draenei went into immediate pain shock from the vibrations alone, and dozens of them collapsed where they stood, and their companions dragged them to safety and huddled together in sealed rooms, trembling and waiting. The Daleks scattered in panic, and their cloud forms fragmented and dispersed, and some of them drifted into vents and got lost in the ductwork, and they floated helplessly, calling out to each other in wavelengths of light that flickered through the damaged corridors like dying stars. The Krethkai sealed their armored bodies and hunkered down in defensive positions, because their instinct was to survive and endure and wait. Everyone followed protocol. Everyone retreated. Everyone moved away from the danger. Everyone except the humans. Lena Vasquez was in the station cafeteria when the explosion hit, and the force threw her across the room, and she slammed into a table and felt something crack in her ribs, and for 3 seconds she lay on the ground, and the pain was bright and sharp and real, and it sang through her nervous system like electricity. And then she was on her feet. She did not check her injuries, and she did not look for a safe zone, and she did not wait for instructions, and she grabbed a fire extinguisher off the wall, and she ran toward the sound of screaming. The corridor leading to the lower ring was buckled, and the floor was tilted at a steep angle, and jagged metal jutted from the walls like broken teeth, and the air was thin and getting thinner, and it was cold enough that her breath came out in white clouds, and she ran anyway. Metal shard caught her left arm as she squeezed through a collapsed doorway, and it opened her skin from elbow to wrist in one clean, terrible line, and blood began pouring immediately, and she looked at it for exactly 1 second, and then she tore her sleeve off with her teeth and tied it around the wound with one hand while still moving. She did not slow down. 3 levels down in a collapsed section of the habitation ring, Rilke was trapped. She had been in a study room with 4 other Delvani students when the ceiling gave way, and now they were pinned beneath debris in a room that was losing atmosphere, and the emergency door had jammed, and they could not get out, and the temperature was dropping, and Rilke's empathic senses were overwhelmed with the pain and terror of everyone around her. She could feel the entire station suffering, and then she felt something else. It was coming from above, and it was moving fast, and it was a signal unlike anything she had ever felt from any living being in her entire life. And it was pain, and it was so much pain, and it was sharp and hot and constant, and it radiated like a sun. But underneath the pain, there was something that made Rilke's breath stop. There was, well, not hope, and not courage, and not adrenaline, something harder and colder and more terrifying than all of those things combined. And it was a conscious, deliberate choice to keep moving, and it burned like a white star in the center of all that pain, and it did not flicker, and it did not waver, and it just kept coming closer. The jammed emergency door shuddered. Then it shuddered again. Then It screamed as something on the other side hit it with tremendous force, and again and again, and again. And on the fifth impact, it buckled inward, and two human hands appeared in the gap, and they were bloody, and the knuckles were split open, and they gripped the edges of the door and pulled. Lena Vasquez forced the door open with her bare hands. And she stood in the doorway, and she was a horror and a miracle all at once. Her left arm was soaked in blood from the gash, and the makeshift bandage had already bled through, and her right eye was swollen shut from where she had hit a wall, and she had two broken ribs that she could feel grinding with every breath, and the air was so thin that she was panting, and her lips were turning blue, and she was smiling. "Come on," she said, "everybody up, and we are getting out of here." She entered the room, and she found a collapsed support beam pinning one of the Delvani students to the ground, and the beam was heavy, and it was metal, and it should have been impossible for a human with broken ribs and a torn arm to move it. Lena got under it, and she braced her legs, and she screamed as she lifted, and the scream was not fear, and it was not despair, and it was fury and defiance, and her body was telling her to stop, and every nerve was begging her to quit, and she told her body no, and she lifted the beam, and through it Rilka stared at her, and she could feel everything and every ounce of agony flooding through this woman, and it was unbearable, and it was beautiful. Lena led them out through two more compromised sections, and she shielded the smaller aliens with her own body when debris fell, and she navigated by memory when the lights failed completely, and when one of the Delvani students began to panic. Lena put a hand on their shoulder and said, "I have got you, and I'm not leaving anyone behind," and her voice was steady, even though her body was shaking from pain and cold and blood loss. Far above, in the safe sections of the station, Torvin was watching the security feeds, and what he saw changed him forever. It was not just Lena. Every single human on Velther Station was doing the same thing. There were 17 humans on the station, and not one of them had gone to a safe zone, and not one of them had followed protocol, and not one of them had waited for rescue. A human cook from the cafeteria had kicked open a jammed door and was carrying a drain-eye student in each arm, running through a corridor that was venting atmosphere. A human engineer was crawling through a collapsed maintenance shaft to reach a trapped Valmori family, and her legs were bleeding from broken glass, and she was singing to keep them calm. A human teacher who worked at the station school for young children was standing in a doorway holding a cracked ceiling panel above her head with both arms to keep it from falling on 4 alien children below her, and her arms were shaking, and her muscles were tearing, and she would not let. Godervan watched a human maintenance worker pick up a piece of metal with hands that were already burned and use it to pry open a sealed door, and the burns got worse with every second, and the human did not stop. 17 humans, all of them moving toward the danger, all of them in pain. None of them stopping. The station was stabilized 40 minutes later when the professional rescue teams finally arrived, and they found that 347 lives had already been saved, and 14 of the 17 humans on the station had sustained significant injuries, and the other 3 had sustained minor injuries only because they ran out of people to save. Lena collapsed in the medical bay, and the doctors listed her injuries and 2 broken ribs and a fractured wrist and lacerations across 40% of her body, and mild hypothermia and oxygen deprivation and blood loss approaching dangerous levels. The medical staff was horrified. Lena opened her one working eye and said, "Is everyone out?" "Yes," said the doctor, "and everyone is safe." Lena nodded and said, "Good. And can I get some coffee?" Rilka sat beside her recovery pod later that night, and she was still trembling from the empathic aftershocks, and her whole body ached with borrowed pain, and she looked at this broken, bleeding, impossible woman and whispered, "I felt it, and I felt all of your pain, and every single bit of it. And how did you keep moving?" Lena looked at her with tired, kind eyes that had seen too much and survived it all, and she said, "Because you were on the other side of it." Rilka broke. She put her head down on the edge of the pod, and she cried And she cried not because she was sad, but because she finally understood what it meant to be human, and it was the most terrifying and the most beautiful thing she had ever known. 1 month later, the auditorium was unrecognizable. They had torn out the walls 3 times, and it was still not enough, and the final count was over 4,000. Beings packed into a space that had been rebuilt from a lecture hall into something closer to an arena, and there were students from every department and professors who had never attended another professor's lecture, and diplomats who had traveled from other star systems, and military commanders who had quietly slipped in through the back, and journalists broadcasting to 900 worlds. Professor Kythaan stood at the center of it all, and for the first time in his long career, he did not look like a professor. He looked like a witness. He stood in silence for a full minute, and 4,000 beings waited, and no one breathed, and no one spoke, and the weight of what had happened on Velther Station still hung over all of them like smoke that refused to clear. He began 30 standard years ago, he said, the Galactic Compact encountered a new species from a Class 12 death world, orbiting an unremarkable yellow star at the edge of the Orion Arm, and this species had no armor and no venom and no claws, and their skin was so thin that light could pass through it in places, and their bones broke easily, and their bodies healed slowly, and they lived for less than a century, and by every metric we used to measure biological success, they should not have survived their own planet, let alone reach the stars. He paused, and yet they did. He pressed a button, and the nervous system scan appeared again, and the web of fire spread across the holographic body, and 4,000 beings stared at it. We spent 30 years debating what we call the human question, he said, and the question was simple, and it was this: what are they? He let the question hang in the air. Some said they were reckless, and that their pain-seeking behavior was a defect and a glitch in their evolutionary code, and that they would burn themselves out within a few generations and collapse under the weight of their own self-destruction. He looked out at the crowd. They did not collapse, he said. Some said they were primitive, and that their tolerance for pain was simply because they had not yet evolved past it, and that given enough time they would develop proper avoidance instincts like every other civilized species. He shook his head. They did not avoid, he said, and they leaned in. Some said they were dangerous, and that a species that runs toward pain and seeks out suffering must be aggressive and violent, and must be contained before they turned that capacity for endurance into a weapon against the rest of the galaxy. He was quiet for a moment, and then Velther Station happened. He said he played the footage. 4,000 beings watched 17 humans run into fire and wreckage and freezing vacuum, and they watched a woman with broken ribs lift a metal beam with her bare hands, and they watched a cook carry 2 unconscious aliens through a corridor that was venting atmosphere, and they watched a teacher hold a collapsing ceiling above 4 children with nothing but her own breaking body, and they watched an engineer crawl through glass on her belly singing a song to keep strangers calm, and they watched every single human on that station choose pain, not because they had to, not because they were ordered to, not because it benefited them in any way, but because someone was hurting on the other side of it. Kythaan stopped the footage. I have studied 914 species, he said, and I have spent my entire life trying to understand what makes each one unique and what makes each one survive. And I have seen incredible things, and I have seen species that can live in vacuum, and species that can swim through stars, and species that can think in 11 dimensions. He looked at the crowd, and his compound eyes were glistening. But I have never seen anything like humans, he said. He stepped forward. They are not broken, he said, and I need every single one of you to hear this, because the answer to the human question is not that they are defective or primitive or dangerous. The answer is that they are the only species in the known galaxy that has learned to transform pain into meaning. He said every scar on a human's body is a story, and every tattoo is a memorial, and every Marathon is a conversation with their own limits, and every hot pepper is a dare against their own nervous system, and every ice bath is a negotiation with their own mortality. He said they do not run from suffering, because they discovered something that no other species ever has, and that discovery is this: pain is not the enemy, pain is the teacher. He showed the montage, and it played across every screen in the auditorium, and it showed humans climbing mountains in the snow and running through rain with blood on their feet and holding their newborn children, which Kythaan explained involves hours of the most extreme pain a human body can experience, and yet they call it the greatest moment of their lives. It showed humans mourning their dead and weeping over graves and tattooing the names of lost loved ones into their skin, so they would carry them forever. It showed humans dancing on injured legs and laughing through tears and holding each other through pain and getting back up after every fall. It showed a woman with a scar on her jaw climbing a rock face 60 meters high with the sun behind her, and reaching the top of their species Kythaan said survived despite pain. He paused and his voice cracked. Humans survived through it. They have taken the worst thing that biology can do to a living creature, and they have made it into a forge, and they walk into that forge again and again, and every time they come out, they are stronger. That is what they are. He said that is the answer to the human question. He stopped the montage in the crowd. Rilke sat with tears streaming down her translucent face, and she had changed her entire academic thesis to focus on human empathic resilience, and she had begun corresponding with human researchers on Earth. And just last week, she had tried a mild capsaicin sauce for the first time, and it had burned her mouth and her eyes had watered, and her empathic system had flared, and she had kept eating. And when the burning faded, she had felt something she had never felt before. She had felt a Livitervan sat like a mountain of armor with his fists on his knees, and he had submitted a transfer request to a joint Krethkai human military exercise program. And when his family asked him why, he had told them, "I have worn armor my entire life, but I have met beings who walk into battle in nothing but skin and bone, and they do not break. And I need to understand how." His mother had asked him what humans had that the Krethkai did not. Something better than honor. He had sage zine floated near the ceiling, and their cloud forms shimmered with colors that no one in the room had ever seen in Nalic produce before, because they had composed a cloud song about the human concept of what they called the beautiful wound, and it had become the most performed piece of music in Nalic history, and other Nalic traveled across star systems to hear it because it made them feel something they had never felt before, and they did not have a word for it. The closest translation was longing for a body that can break. Kythaan stepped to the podium one final time. "I have submitted a revision to the Galactic Species Classification Index," he said, "and it has been reviewed and approved, and I would like to read it to you now." He opened the document, and the room fell silent, and 4,000 beings listened. Species human, also known as Homo sapiens, origin Sol 3, also known as Earth, and classified as a Class 12, Death World, pain response hyperacute, with full spectrum sensitivity across all nerve types. Threat classification revised from standard fauna to apex persistence predator. He looked up from the document cultural note. He read, and his voice was steady and clear, and it carried to every corner of that enormous room. "Do not mistake their softness for weakness, because they choose to feel everything, and they are stronger for it, and in the entire galaxy, only humans have learned to make pain beautiful." The auditorium was silent. Then slowly from every corner of the room, and in every way that every species present could express it, the room began to respond. And the Delvani glowed, and the Krethkai stomped, and the Nalic shimmered, and the Velmori chimed, and the Draenei hummed, and 4,000 beings from dozens of worlds, who had spent their entire lives avoiding pain, looked at each other and understood, for the first time, why one small, soft, breakable species from one small, dangerous world had managed to reach the stars. They applauded. They did not stop for a very long time, and somewhere across the galaxy on a planet that was too hot and too cold, and too wet and too dry and full of predators and poisons and earthquakes and storms. There Lena Vasquez was sitting on a mountainside, watching the sun go down, and her ribs were still healing, and her arm was still bandaged, and the scar on her jaw caught the last of the light. Her communicator buzzed, and she opened it and saw a recorded message from Kythaan, and she played it. And when it finished, she smiled. Then she stood up even though it hurt, and she looked out at the horizon, and somewhere up there in the dark, between the stars, an entire galaxy was finally beginning to understand what every human had always known. That the things that break you are the same things that build you. That scars are not damage, but maps of everywhere you have been. That the species which feels the most pain and chooses to keep going anyway is not the weakest species in the galaxy, it is the strongest. Lena took a deep breath, and it hurt because her ribs were still cracked, and she smiled because it hurt, and she started walking down the mountain because there was always another mountain and humans never stopped climbing.